Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second class General Assembly 2022. I'm your host, Francis Kilantang. And before we start, please be reminded of the following guidelines. First, kindly make sure that you have registered for this assembly. The registration link can be accessed below at the comment section. Uh, the secretariat will comment it. For your questions, comments, and insights, please feel free to share or post them as comments, and this will be entertained during the open forum as we will be having our lecture later with Sir Richard Chu. Also, do not forget to accomplish the website survey from which will be posted later at the comment section. Only those who have registered and have accomplished the website survey form are entitled to receive an electronic certificate. This General Assembly is jointly sponsored by UNITAS or UST's UNITAS, UST's Open Access Multidisciplinary Journal of Advanced Research on Literature, Culture, and Society, which was established in 1922 and will be a century old this July. The upcoming class lecture series, which is open to all for free, is part of UNITAS's sponsoring for loyal reader, educators, and the world of scholarship. For more information on the lineup of activities in relation to class, you may visit the official Facebook page and YouTube channel of class. To start with this program, we would like to introduce to you Dr. Maria Luisa Torres, the editor-in-chief of UNITAS and president of CLASS, or Cultural, Literary, and Art Studies Society Incorporated, for her welcome remarks.
And Art Studies Society, Inc., or CLASS for short. As many of you might know by now, it is the only national professional organization of its kind in terms of scope and membership that has an international coverage. For those class members who have been active in the international conference circuit in the profession, in many ways, you might have recognized that CLASS is turning out to be the Philippines' own version of the Modern Language Association, or MLA, in its determined effort to address a similar set of professional needs as well as opportunities. Today's assembly consists of two parts. The first part is the assembly itself, and the second part consists of a lecture by an esteemed guest who will be introduced later. To put such important activities in perspective as we're having today, please allow me to remind us all that two of the main goals of CLASS, which bind us together, are the following. One is to promote and facilitate the sharing of ideas and expertise between and among researchers, scholars of literary, cultural, and art studies, as well as faculty members of literature, composition, rhetoric, creative writing, culture, the arts, and related fields of study like language studies and critical pedagogy in the institutions of higher learning and senior high school. Two, to create and promote a community of faculty members and academics of the above-mentioned fields of study, national and international, and internationally. With reference to the first, the class lecture series is geared precisely to address the goal. It has been conducted since 2021 in cooperation with the Commission on Higher Education's Technical Committee for Literature, the Unitas Journal of UST, and Critica Cultura Journal of the Ateneo de Manila University, all meant to facilitate such an exchange. With reference to the second, our class general assemblies and committees and committee activities are all meant to achieve the second goal. The organizational meetings on various levels for different activities and projects conducted all year round are meant to ensure that members can create and promote our community of academics, practitioners, researchers, and scholars, and respond to our common needs in the profession. Each year, starting in June, class will sponsor a new lecture series targeting the classroom setting. It is primarily geared towards developing flexible and relevant ways of teaching a range of subjects offered in the CHED-sponsored or CHED-approved new AB literature curriculum. This lecture series has been organized in the context of the teaching and learning limitations and challenges imposed by the COVID pandemic. But beyond COVID, it has been conceptualized in view of maximizing the potentials, reach, and power of what we call the virtual classroom. Topics of the online lectures will range from new curricular content to pedagogy, in consideration of up-to-date scholarship to effective classroom delivery of the syllabus. Indeed, our colleagues and experts in their particular fields have agreed to be part of the series covering specific topics indicated in mandated subjects such as cultural studies, creative writing, literature content courses, and the use of technology in the classroom or classnet setting, among others. A particular installment of the lecture series, which will take place in the first half of September, will be a group book launch of 2 books and a monograph by international members of class. In this launch, we wish to highlight our goal to encourage our class members here and abroad, not only to become excellent teachers, but equally engaged in scholarship. From this, we look forward to more book launchings of our class members here and abroad. The tentative lecture schedule of the lectures is as follows. On June 24, Dr. Mark Kayanan of Ateneo de Manila University will be delivering a lecture on the teaching of creative writing, focusing on poetry. On July 1, Dr. Carlos Fiocos of the De La Salle University will be talking about teaching Southeast Asian cultural studies. On July 8, Mr. Francis Soliano of the Ateneo de Manila University will be sharing with us his experience on teaching law and literature. On July 15, Dr. Milagros Laurel of the University of the Philippines will be delivering a talk on teaching literature in a language classroom. On July 22, our esteemed Dr. Cristina Pantoa Hidalgo, a member of the Board of Directors of class, will be delivering a lecture on teaching creative writing, focusing on creative nonfiction. And finally, on July 29, Father Jesus J. Miranda, OP, a well-known educator, will be delivering a lecture on constructivist education. So we hope to see you there from late June to all Fridays of July. The lectures are all meant to help our faculty members to teach some of the courses in the new AUB curriculum, as well as a couple of similar subjects taught in senior high school. Just as importantly, they are meant for us to reflect on the role of the classroom in developing skills as well as attitudes and values, but also in developing scholarship for a critical citizenry and education. Today, let's all take part in the assembly with some exciting announcements from our secretariat and different committees about projects, and listen to the much anticipated lecture by our highly esteemed Filipino scholar and historian based in the US academia, but whose heart is very much with us here. So, in the name of class, let's do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lulu Reyes, for the very insightful remarks for this assembly. To proceed with this program, I would like to call on Ms. Kimberly Nicole Panis for the Membership Committee report, followed by yours truly for the Publicity Committee report, and lastly, Mr. Joey Clotario for the class website under the Pedagogy and Scholarship Committee report, and also with some announcements as well per committee. Let me call on Ms. Panis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible po? Can you hear me po? So let me first share my screen. Nakikita naman po ba yung screen? Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Miss Kim, the Vice Chair of Membership Committee and General Secretariat of Class. And I am here to present to you our Membership Committee report. And before I start, I would like to remind you to answer the website survey form later after the General Assembly and the special lecture from Dr. Richard Chu. So the link will be posted in our comment section later. So for the class membership list, school year 2020 to 2001, obviously we have a growing number of registered members from this year, school year, probably because of the membership fee is waived. And as you can see on the slide, there are a lot of members who would like to be part of scholarship committee, so which is a total of 73 members. And the next is the membership committee, which has a total of 68 members. 66 members for the pedagogy and 17 members for the publicity committee. So overall, we have 224 members in total. This includes active and inactive members. So when it comes to demographics, we have a lot of members in the NCR region. And in general, lahat ng members na nagpa-register for membership ay galing mostly sa State University, lahat ng branches ng UP, Ateneo, and meron ding from the UST, UE, FEU, and LaSalle. So since wave po yung membership natin nung school year 2020 to 2001, ngayon po meron na po tayo membership payments for the school year 2022 to 2023. So these are the classes of members. So for the institutional annual fee po, 2,000 pesos. So the institutional membership is for schools and universities offering programs in cultural, literary, and art studies and has a serious interest in the purpose of the organization. And then regular members naman po is 1,000 pesos is for active associate members of good standing in the organization for at least 1 year from the date of approval in the nomination for regular membership. And 500 pesos naman po sa associate members for faculty or students engaged in teaching, publishing, researches in literature, cultural and art studies courses for at least 3 years and recommended for membership by a regular member of class. And for the international membership, we have $25. So faculty actively engaged in teaching, publishing, researches in literature, culture, and art studies, courses in schools, universities outside the Philippines. And we have these qualifications of membership. So have attended a class assembly or activity. So be a professional in the field of cultural, literary, and art studies, and be recommended in writing to the board by at least one regular member who shall be accountable to the body for the validity of the applicant's qualifications, evaluated by the board and voted upon by a simple majority of the regular members during a regular meeting, and be provided a copy of the certificate of membership and invoice upon payment, and be formally inducted in the presence of other members. And for the payment methods, to be announced, actually, hindi pa po kami magko-collect ngayon, pero binibigyan ko na po kayo ng idea na maybe before this year ends, mag-collect na rin po kami ng payments for membership. So yung modes of payments po ay to be announced because pinaprocess pa lang po until now yung kung saang right mode of payments tayo pwede magbayad. And kapag na-announce ko na po or na-announce na namin through class Facebook page and emails, members should accomplish the membership forms and a screenshot or picture of payment as evidence. And bigyan ko na rin po kayo ng idea na ang membership payment is until December 2022 for the school year 2022 to 2023. Kapag naman po may extension po sa deadline ng payments, again, I will announce it to via class Facebook page and then sa email din po. So don't worry po, hindi po kayo magugulat na naniningil po kami for the membership. And meron din po tayong extension for that. And for the class membership rights and privileges, so the class members has the right to support of class and divorce, right to promote of CLA works, right to participate in all class activities, right to vote, right to be voted upon, right to due process, privilege to represent class, discount privilege for the international conference. So I don't know po kung na-receive nyo po or nakita nyo po dun sa Facebook page po namin, and I even emailed the class members po for the school year 2020 to 2021 na meron po call for papers for the Korea conference. So may mga nag-submit na po, and meron po silang 50% discount for that conference. Kasi yung conference po sa Konkuk University, $100 po yung conference fee. So sponsored by class, I'm sorry, $200 po yung conference fee dun sa Konkuk University sa Korea. And meron tayong 50% discount para dun sa class member na makakapag-submit and approved by the board yung paper po nila. And these are the accomplishment of class members from meron po tayong mga international conferences, so held online last October 30, 2021, which is the Global Mobility Humanities Conference in Korea. And last March 25 to 26, 2022, reading the regions, Himaya, which is held online then, and another international conference held online last May 15. Last May 15, which is the Ethical Criticism Studies in China. So for our upcoming events naman po, we have class lecture series, lahat po ng Fridays ng July. So we will also post it in our class page, Facebook page. And lahat po kung hindi po kayo maka-attend or makapanood po ng class lecture series for July, may upload po namin ito sa YouTube channel po natin. And I will also email you kung interesado po kayo for all of these lecture series. And we also have international conference sa Konkuk University. Ito po yung call for paper namin last May 30, yung extended deadline ng papers. So we are still selecting po, deliberating the papers who have submitted din po ng mga abstracts po nila para ma-approve din po ng board kung sino po yung entitled for the 50% discount. And we also have our book launch then and upcoming meetings. And again, before I end my report, I would like to remind you to answer the website survey later after po ng program natin ng General Assembly and the special lecture with Dr. Richard CHU. And I will post the link here sa comment section po. Thank you. May question po ba kayo for the membership? May question po ba? The book launch, yung book launch po to be announced po. So yung book launch po natin ay isa po din sa mga class members po. Si Ma'am Lulu po ang magpe-present po for the book launch. Yung mga class members po natin na nakapag-publish po and then ipopromote po natin dito sa class organization po. To be announced po lahat to. May questions pa po ba? Kung may mga questions pa po kayo tungkol sa mga payments, you may message us through class Facebook page and you may also email me din. Ako din po yung sumasagot po lahat ng mga inquiries po. So, change of committee to be announced din. Si Ma'am Lulu din po ang may final word. Yung board po may final word for the change of committee. Don't worry. Pero dito po sa registration nyo po, di ba? Sinelect nyo po kung saan committee po kayo sasali. So, yun po ang magiging reference po namin if ever na may mga upcoming meetings po ng mga committees. Questions po? Do you have any questions po? Clear na po? So, yun po. Kung may pahabol questions po kayo later, you may message me na lang po. So, thank you very much for listening. So, I will give the floor to Mr. Francis Quilantang for the Publicity Committee report. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Panis, for that very insightful, very detailed presentation. Sa amin naman, sa Publicity Committee, actually, hindi naman ganun kadami yung aming i-report ngayon. Because last year, when we presented our goals, no, although konti lang yung aming na-propose doon, these are big projects that we have accomplished naman, no? So last year we have proposed the creation of a Facebook page of class, and we have fulfilled that project of ours, that goal of ours. And currently we have 442 likes and 512 followed us on our official Facebook page. And on that Facebook page as well, we conduct live lecture series. So far, we have conducted 13 lecture series from our Facebook page. And we also created a YouTube page. And as you can see, we only have 16 subscribers. So I would like to invite everyone to please subscribe to our YouTube channel so that we can post live sessions as well. Because YouTube is one of the criteria of YouTube Live is for your channel to have at least 400 subscribers and 44,000 watch hours. So we need to achieve that so that we can post live on YouTube as well. So these are just the major accomplishments of the publicity committee, the Facebook and the YouTube pages and channels that we have accomplished so far. Plus pa rin po yung mga publications or publicity needs ng different committees natin. So sana yung mga nag-register, kami po ang pinaka-konting committee sa lahat. Kaya we really need your help as well, especially yung mga may alam sa technology, editing ng mga collaterals. And that's it for the publicity committee. I now pass the time to Mr. Joey Clotario for the pedagogy and website committee as well.
Assessment survey. So if you haven't accessed the website of class, it's actually accessible through abiliterature-philippines.com. And it's a website that contains information on literature courses and subjects under literature and cultural studies. So this website is actually an initiative of class in cooperation with the CHED Technical Committee on Literature in response to the national demand for alternative resource materials for flexible instruction and online learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. Because of the electronic inaccessibility of Philippine publications and resources, this website seeks to address this deficiency and provide selective texts, modules, and other pedagogical aids as a modest assistance to the literature teachers in the Philippines. This site's resource materials are in conjunction with the curriculum guidelines indicated in the CMO number 21 series of 2017. So here, you can access different information about the AB Literature and AB Literary and Cultural Studies program, academic programs. And here it contains the core courses as indicated in the CMO number 21 series of 2017. The committee is currently in the process of developing further the website so that it could address the demands and the needs of the clients, particularly the members of class. And that is the reason why we are doing the client needs assessment survey so that we could improve and develop further the class website. So by completing this survey, you will help the officers of class to understand your needs and prepare contents that will be useful and relevant to you and your profession. You will be asked to answer several questions in the survey, including your personal and professional details, website usage information, and some of your recommendations for the improvement of the contents in the class website. So this will only take 15 to 20 minutes of your time. And I hope that all of us will be able to answer this survey so that the committee could take action and implement the necessary developments so that this resource could be more useful to everyone. Again, thank you for your participation in the class clients needs assessment survey, and rest assured that the committee will take all of the recommendations to improve the website. Thank you and have a great day.
And mga short but sweet presentations from our committee members and committee reports. And now that we are all in good terms of clarification regarding the membership, class website as a useful tool for teaching, and other accomplishments and upcoming events for this class school year of 2022-2023, may we now proceed to the last part of this program, which is the special lecture. Is Sir Richard ready? Is Sir Richard already here and ready?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Before we begin with this lecture again, I would like to remind you to not forget to accomplish the website survey form, which will be posted later at the comment section after the special lecture. Only those who have registered and have accomplished the website survey form are entitled to receive an electronic certificate. Okay, so let's proceed to the lecture. This afternoon's lecture, the talk is entitled The Orientalist Figures of the Chinese in the Philippines During the Early American Colonial Period. Okay, let me just flash the bio notes here. The abstract reads, the U.S. acquisition of the Philippines from Spain as a consequence of American defeat of the Spanish in the Spanish-American War of 1898 sparked sudden interest among the American public about the country. Subsequently, a plethora of books, newspaper articles, and other published materials came out describing the country and its people, including the Chinese. The talk identifies and describes 7 different figures of the Chinese in the Philippines based on the examination and analysis of these different sources. These figures include the invasive and unassimilable foreigner, indispensable pariah, Judy and filthy public menace, moral and social deviant, the Chinese half-breed, crafty and unscrupulous merchant and artisan, and the other. The significance of this study is to demonstrate that the Yellow Peril discourse in the US had transnational dimensions that need to be examined in order to understand the Chinaman question more fully in the Philippines during this critical period. It also seeks to demonstrate how the racializations of the Chinese upheld US imperialist ambitions in the Asia-Pacific region, as well as justified the extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act to the country in 1902. This afternoon's lecture will be delivered by Richard T. Chu. He received his AB from Ateneo de Manila University, his MA from Stanford University, and his PhD from University of Southern California. His research and publications focus on the history of the Chinese and Chinese mestizos in the Philippines and of the different Chinese diasporic communities in the world, centering on issues of race, ethnicity, gender, empire, and nationalism. His first book, The Chinese and Chinese Mestizos of Manila, Family Identity and Culture from 1860s to 1930s, examines and analyzes the familial and business practices of Chinese merchant families as they negotiated the attempts of colonial governments to control them. His next major book project, The Chinaman Question, a conundrum in U.S. imperial policy in the Philippines from 1898 to 1908, is an examination of the racialization of the identities of the Chinese in the Philippines during the first decade of American colonial rule. He is editor of More Chinoy Than We Admit, Vibal in 2015, an anthology of studies on the Chinese in the Philippines, and co-editor with Mark Blasius of More Tomboy, More Bakla Than We Admit, Insights into Sexual and Gender Diversity in Philippine Culture, History, and Politics. to give his talk. Let us all welcome Dr. Chu. Let me just make you co-host so you can also share your presentation. And again, without further ado, here's Dr. Richard Chu.
Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you, Kim. Thank you also to class and Unitas for inviting me today to give a lecture on my next book project. And thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. So let me just open my PowerPoint here. I just want to make sure if you can hear me clearly and if you can see the PowerPoint on the screen.
Sir, you're clear and your presentation is seen.
Okay, thank you again, Francis. So here, let me show you first slide, which is the my book project, my next book project. As Francis had mentioned earlier, I'm currently writing this next book project. So it's a work in progress, and the title is The Chinaman Question, a Conundrum in U.S. Imperial Policy in the Philippines from 1898 to 1908, which is basically the first 10 years of American colonial rule. And it has 5 chapters along with an introduction, as you can see on the screen. And the lecture that I'm going to give today is based on the second chapter, which I call The Peculiar Chinese, the racialization of the Chinese in the Philippines during the first few years of American colonization. So just a quick overview of this book project. Why am I writing it? You see, there is little or very few scholarship on the history of the Chinese in the Philippines during this period, which is the first early years or decade of American colonial period. And it is a very important time in Philippine history because not only because the country was under a new colonial rule, but also the new rulers would implement certain policies that would have lasting impact on Philippine society, as well as on the Chinese community in the Philippines. So let me give you an overview of the history during this period. But before that, the aim of this chapter is to provide the reader with the lens or gaze of these outsiders, particularly American writers, journalists, and so on and so forth, of their their impression of the Chinese population in the Philippines. And in the process of doing so, I hope to add more historical information about the Chinese not found in previous scholarship. And another aim of this chapter is to analyze how the Chinese in the country were racialized in order to support the establishment of the American colonial state, as well as to justify the application of the exclusion laws of the Chinese in the Philippines. So if you haven't heard about it, when the Americans took over the Philippines, they were faced with this conundrum, what to do with the large number of Chinese in the country. During the Spanish colonial period, Spanish immigration laws, especially in the 19th century, were more lax, and that allowed more Chinese to come in. So when the Americans took over in 1898, they were surprised to see all these Chinese in the Philippines, and they didn't know whether to allow them to continue coming in or to exclude them. And another goal is to Well, I do not aim to provide a complete and accurate account of the past, but rather windows onto dominant ideologies, anxieties, and classifications of the time. And I also aim to read them closely for, and I'm quoting from this scholar named Claire Sears, for silence and its effects. So the sources that I use for this chapter include uh, these travelogues that were published by established publishers in the United States, publishers like, as you can see here on the screen, Andy Thompson, F. Tennyson Neely. Now, when the Americans took over the Philippines, uh, many of the Americans in the United States did not know anything about the country. Even President William McKinley at that time was not even sure where the Philippines was. So, but when the Americans took over the Philippines, there was a large demand from the American public, for books, for information uh, about the Philippines, and so these publishers sort of took advantage of that increased interest to publish these books about the country, and they commissioned um, certain journalists, especially war correspondents or missionaries or well-known travelers to write these books about the Philippines. And these are just examples on the screen that I use for my study. And apart from the books that these publishers published, so these newspapers were published around that time in order to cater to American soldiers who were uh, assigned or sent to other parts of the world, including the Philippines, to fight on behalf of the United States. And so they published certain newspapers called soldier newspapers. And apart from that, I also use newspapers, the more commercial ones like the New York Times, Los Angeles Herald. And the method that I used to study the racialization of the Chinese by these texts, or these documents include the use of the discursive or discourse analysis, which is a method of qualitative analysis focusing on the quote, social aspects of communication and the ways people use language to achieve specific effects, end of quote. And so the words and phrases that I found in these texts about the Chinese are analyzed for American ideological associations, formality, and euphemistic and metaphorical content. So going back then to the historical context of the times under which these events unfolded, the time period that I'm focusing. So many of you know this history already, starting from the colonization of Spain, of the Philippines by Spain from 1565 to 1898, and then the Philippine Revolution against Spain, then the Spanish-American War of 1898, which led the United States to become involved in the Philippines because the Philippines was still a colony of Spain then. And in the Spanish-American War, the United States government decided to also take over the Philippines, which was one of the last remaining colonies of Spain, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Marianas. And as we know, during this war, Emilio Aguinaldo declared the Philippine independence on June 12 of 1898. But at the same time, Spain and the United States were just doing their own thing. They they didn't recognize the independence, and they signed the Treaty of Paris in December of 1898, which ceded the Philippines to the United States for $20 million, along with the other remaining colonies of Spain to the United States. And the US president at the time, William McKinley, proclaimed a policy of benevolent assimilation for the Philippines, which was hardly benevolent because, as you know, the Filipinos and the Americans fought under the Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902, where hundreds of thousands of Filipinos died. And then there was the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900. And during the first few years, there was the debate whether to apply the Chinese exclusion laws, which was at the time existed in the United States. So in 1882, the United States implemented the Chinese exclusion law, which barred or prohibited Chinese laborers from coming into the US. So when they took over the Philippines, they were questioning or deciding whether they should also apply the same Exclusion Act in the Philippines. And the US Congress decided in 1902 to extend the Exclusion Act. And then the Philippine Bill of 1902 also created a civilian government in the Philippines and also established citizenship, nationalized citizenship, in which the category of Filipino was created. But the Chinese in the Philippines were not allowed to become Filipino citizens. They were instead considered as aliens, even though many of them have lived in the Philippines for most of their lives and also had married or local wives, no? Or local women, and also had families in the Philippines. And because of these repressive exclusionary laws, which was being applied in the US and in the Philippines, that the Chinese communities in these two countries decided to boycott American goods in 1905. So this is again the historical context of this chapter that I'm discussing in this lecture. Some more historical context, but more specifically about the Chinese in the Philippines. The Chinese were called Sanglei at the time under the Spanish colonial period, which means in Chinese, one who often comes. And then they came in as traders as well as skilled and unskilled workers. They were carpenters, furniture makers, bricklayers, and later on they were, especially in the 19th century, many of them worked as cargadores, in the docks because of the increased import-export trade at that time. And so that's when you see that toward the 19th century, the Philippines was becoming more commercialized when the Spanish government opened up its market to the world market and implemented a more cash crop-oriented economy. And the Chinese who were in the Philippines played the role of middlemen for the Spanish colonial state and for the domestic economy. That's why many of them went into retail. They were importing all these goods from China and from other countries, and they were distributing these goods to many parts of the Philippines. And during the Spanish colonial period, many Chinese also intermarried with Chinese mestizas or Indias, and in order for them to marry the local women in the church, they had to be converted to Catholicism. And the children that they had were classified as Chinese mestizos. And at the turn of towards the end of the 19th century, there were around 60 to 90,000 Chinese living in the Philippines. Now, here's just a map of where most of the Chinese from the Philippines came from, and this is the southeastern coastal region of China, but more specifically the province of Fujian. And these are some of the cities here that you can see where they came from Amoy, from Changzhou, from Quanzhou. And then there were some people from the Guangdong province and from Canton or from Macau who also participated in this trade economy with the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia. So even before the Spaniards came in 1565, the Chinese were already trading with the inhabitants of the different islands in the Philippines. Now, so after looking at all these published travelogues that were published between 1898 to 1905, and also reading some of the newspapers during this time, these were the sort of the figures that I managed to deduce from all these materials, and I categorized them into 7. The first one is the figure of the Chinese in the Philippines as an so if you read these, find that they have stories of the Chinese invading the Philippines, or when it was under the Spanish colonial, the Spanish rulers. Some of these stories include the invasion of Limahong in 1574, then also in 1662, the forces of Kok Singha or Zheng Chengkong, who is one of the Ming Dynasty loyalists, also invaded, tried to take over Manila. So all these stories, and I won't go any more into detail, gave the readers, which is the American public, the impression that the Chinese in the Philippines were a part, not part of the Philippine society, that they were foreign, foreigners, by again emphasizing this history of the Chinese and categorizing them as aliens, as not just aliens, but dangerous aliens who tried to take over the Philippines from Spain. And then also they were categorized as a group of people who were clannish, who were living apart from the Filipinos, and therefore, again, this emphasized the separateness of the Chinese from the Filipinos. And they also used derogatory terms to refer to them, calling them, for example, Chinaman, Chink, Mongols, or Celestials. Now, this is just one example from the texts or books that I have examined and included in my work. For example, Marion Wilcox, who's the editor of this book called Harper's History, on page 6, you can see here, I just highlighted what he said about the Chinese in the Philippines. It says here that the admitted facts are that when the panic spread and the Chinese caught the alarm. So this is talking about this massacre of the Chinese in 1603 that happened in the Philippines. So he was trying to describe what was happening. So when the panic spread and the Chinese caught the alarm, these so-called harmless individuals themselves openly declared hostilities, advanced to the attack, and succeeded in slaughtering almost the entire force of Spaniards and armed natives sent against them. So again, these books, newspapers, zeroed in on these conflicts between the Chinese and the Filipinos and the Spaniards. Again, to demonstrate that they were different from the Filipinos and obviously from the Spaniards. And the second figure that I was able to extrapolate from all these documents was the figure of the indispensable pariah. Scholars have noted that during the Spanish colonial period, the Spaniards were actually threatened by the Chinese. Again, because there were, in the earlier history, there were some threats of invasion, and also they were also jealous of the Chinese controlling parts of the economy. So there were several times when the Spaniards tried to limit their immigration to the Philippines. But even though they tried to do that, they really couldn't do without Chinese, because the Chinese had managed to again participate in the economy of the Philippines, especially in the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. They were the ones who were bringing the goods from China, and therefore the Spaniards needed them in order for this galleon trade to succeed. So so even though the Spaniards considered the Chinese as pariahs, they were shown to be indispensable. That the Spaniards could not really exclude them, or stop the Chinese from coming to the Philippines, because if they did that, then the economy suffered. So this is one quote that I got from the newspaper San Francisco Call, where it said, quote, "The usefulness of the Chinaman throughout all the Far East is referred to time and again. In Australia, the problem is twofold: how to keep the Chinaman out, and what to do without him. He is sorely needed in certain regions where the white man cannot work and live. But the Australian Labor Party is very strong and cannot allow of discriminations of this kind. It is a racial question rather than one of cheap competition." So not only in the Philippines were the Chinese very much present, but also in other parts of the world, like Australia, where it seems that these other places were also facing their own Chinaman question, what to do with the Chinese laborers who were coming to their places, and also Chinese merchants who were offering competition against other people. Now, a third figure that I identified is that of the dirty and filthy public menace. And so when you read again these accounts, descriptions by these American writers of the Chinese in the Philippines, when they refer to Binondo, oftentimes they use or they conjure images of a crowded, unhygienic, filthy place where the Chinese were also demonstrated to eat rats. They lived in crowded homes, and so that they were the spreaders of they spread disease. And so again, that's the one figure that one could glean from these sources. And again, this is one example of the writings. I just quote there, and you can just read the one in bold letters from. So this is from this writer Needham Freeman. In his book A Soldier in the Philippines, he said, and I quote, "The Chinese are the filthiest people there. I have seen hundreds of them living in their workhouses where a stench was arising too great for a white man to approach. These filthy people cook, eat, and sleep all in this filthy hole." Okay, so you see many of these kinds of descriptions being attributed to the Chinese and the way they lived. And this is another example. One of the writers also described that in Binondo that you could see some Chinese in their shops selling rats. No? So again, this was perpetuating this image of the Chinese as unhygienic. Since not only do they live like rats, but they also ate rats. And these are just some of the images that I took from these travel logs or from these sources. And this is a photo of the Chinese of a street in Chinatown, which I believe is Escolta. Now, the fourth figure that seemed to appear regularly is that of a moral and social deviant. That the Chinese was the nominal Catholic and the bigamist. So some of these writers point to, for example, the religious practices of these Chinese as being religion of pagans, or heathens, because they practiced or believed in Buddhism. But also, there were some Chinese who actually converted to Catholicism. And when they do talk about these Catholic Chinese, they also mention that they were nominal Catholics, because that not only did they convert for pragmatic reasons, but also when you observe their religious practices, they were mixing Buddhist and Catholic practices. So they're not really true or authentic Catholics. And apart from their religious practices, these writers also pointed out that many Chinese practiced bigamy or polygamy, that they had more than one wife, and also that many of them intermarried with local women, leading to a population of mestizos. So you have to remember that for Americans, it was miscegenation was a taboo. They were against intermarriages because they felt that they need to protect their own race, and so especially the white race. So in the United States, they forbade the intermarriage of white people with non-white people. So there were very strong anti-miscegenation laws in the United States. But when they came to the Philippines, they saw that everybody was like mestizo. Everybody you will see in some of the descriptions how they describe the Filipinos later on. But we'll go back to that. So one of the writers, like Dean Worcester, said that the Chinese who converted to Catholicism normally embrace Christianity as it helps business, because for many of they claim that the Chinese converted to Catholicism so they could get godfathers, establish these sort of these what do you call it? A patron-client kind of relationship. If you have a godfather who's influential, so when you get baptized, or when you baptize your children, then you have these godparents, with whom you can, especially if they're very influential, with whom you can establish connections that would help your own business. So this is what the outsiders observe about Chinese Catholics. And this is another description about the Chinese in Mindanao, where again, it talks derogatorily about the Chinese Christians who convert out of pragmatism or for material advantages. Now, going to that fifth figure, which I alluded to in figure number 4, the Chinese half-breed. And this is a quotation, right? They call them half-breed. And many of these American writers noticed that Filipinos were a mixed race, that many of them had Spanish, Chinese, or Japanese ancestry or other race in their bloodline. And then they also pointed out that these mixed race children uh, inherited some of the attributes from, in the case of the Spanish or Chinese mestizo, that they inherited some of these traits from. They describe some of the traits that they inherited from their Chinese father or from their Spanish father. And the accounts also exoticized mestizo women, and the Chinese mestizo women were described as exotic but less attractive than Spanish mestizo women. And you can also see or read many accounts about the Chinese mestizos as being responsible for the revolution versus Spain. Like Emilio Aguinaldo was half Chinese, and that the Chinese mestizos were the ones who really fomented this um, protest and this opposition against colonial rule, beginning from the Spanish, from the Revolution versus Spain, to the time of the U.S. invasion of the Philippines. That again, Emilio Aguinaldo and his Chinese mestizo generals and officials were the ones encouraging Filipinos to occurrence or recurrence of these writers referring to the Igorot Chinese that they saw, that they mentioned that up in the north, that there's a kind of a peculiar group of Filipinos who were half Igorot, half Chinese. And so there's again this fascination with mestizaje, that phenomenon of mixed race or mixing of races, because again they were concerned about how to rule over the Filipinos if they're mixed race, and you have all these mixed race populations, and for them that is something that could be dangerous. Again, because of their belief in the purity of blood as a and as sort of the norm or natural law, and that all the mestizaje, all the mixing of different races would produce generations of mixed race people who were either dangerous or inferior. So this would explain why there was such a fascination about Filipinos and the mixed race. So one of the writers, for example, I quoted, and he said, "Foreign blood gained from intermarriage with Negritos, Indonesians, Chinese, Japanese, Europeans, and even with Mexicans, the children of Filipino mothers and Spaniards, Chinese, Japanese, or other foreigners form a separate class known as mestizos, in distinction to the more or less pure Filipinos." Who said, "There are few pure bloods of any race. Most of the native born or three races, notably the mestizos, who are half Chinese or Spanish and the other half Malay or whatnot. And in Manila, the common saying is, quote, lucky is he who knows his own father," end of quote. But Manila is not a city of many nationalities, there being practically no races represented outside those mentioned, except an occasional German or Englishman, or more seldom still an American. So So again, in these bold letters, you can see how they describe the Chinese, especially the Spanish and the Chinese mestizos. They're contrasting Spanish and Chinese mestizos. Usually they have a higher regard for the Spanish mestizos. And for the Chinese mestizos, they say, for example, here in the middle, that the Chinese mestizos are unattractive in person and manner. Here, and it says here, the Chinese mestizo men have grown wealthy as traders and merchants, but they are generally or universally regarded as tricky and do not possess the confidence of the public. They have the mongrel stamp of countenance and are full of intrigue and low cunning. And then you have also from these books photos of the Chinese mestizo. Here you have the photo of the Chinese mestizo girl on the lower left side, and another photo that I took. Again, these are books not that were read by the American public. So this gave them the first impressions of the Filipino people, of the Filipino society and culture. And again, here you see this fascination with these mestizo women. And then there are these again references to the Chinese mestizo as the ones who were leading the revolution or resistance from resistance to Spanish and American rule. And so the way they again describe the mestizo in this example is that they were actually revolting against Spain and the U.S. only because they had selfish reasons, that they wanted to be the rulers of the country, but that they are not just ambitious, but they are also corrupt. So Emilio Aguinaldo was portrayed by a lot of these books and even magazines and newspapers back in the US as someone who was an opportunista, that he was just doing this for himself, for his own ambitions. And then again, there's this fascination with a group of Igorot Chinese, and some of the descriptions that they gave about this group of people. Again, here in the bold section, they said, this writer, William Bryan, said that the Igorot Chinese customs are much the same as the pure Igorots, but with their fierceness is blended the cunning and astuteness of the Mongol, which is the Chinese. And while this intelligence may be often misapplied, it raises them above the pure natives. This Igorot Chinese race is so unique as to possess more than the average interest of wild peoples. It is without competition in its particular line, where there is not another similar tribe of people on the face of the globe. So the sixth figure that often came out was of the Chinese as a crafty and unscrupulous merchant and artisan. So many of these texts first describe what the Chinese were doing for their occupations. Many of them were merchants, they were store owners, but many of them also engaged in skilled and unskilled work. And they describe the Chinese as being pervasive in the economy, such as, again, from Dean Worcester, he said that the Chinese were not just a big group of people and they mostly live in the cities, but that most of them were engaged in trade or in business. And this particular quote also mentioned that the retail business of the Philippines is almost those practices. In this example, they refer to the propensity of the Chinese, whom they, as you can see here, some writers call them the Chinamen, that they would tend to cheat when selling their items by either falsifying the weights and the measures or engaging adulteration of their products. So the last figure that I extrapolated from these documents was the figure of the other. Mind you, all these figures are overlapping. They're not hard and discrete or separate figures. So you can see here in this description that these behavior or descriptions overlap with the other figures. But I often notice that the Chinese was often referred to in contradistinction to either the Spaniards or the Filipinos. And again, when they're being contrasted against the Filipinos or the Spaniards, it is often with the perspective that, you know, how are we going to rule the country? How are we going to rule especially the Filipinos? And so one of the things that one can see is that they talk about how the Chinese had some good but mostly bad influence on the Filipinos. But when they're saying this, for example, when they're saying that the Chinese had some good influence on Filipinos, that from this quote, for example, the Chinese have been civilizers, not only setting the natives an example of regulated and persevering industry, but taking the lead in commerce and imparting a practical knowledge of important things, conspicuously the working of iron and the process of sugar making. So when you read these descriptions, the writer was trying to figure out whether the Filipinos could be trained to be skilled workers as well. So that's sort of the hidden motive in these descriptions. It's always with the mind of what is the Filipino as a race? Is the Filipino race that can be trained, that can be civilized, that can be become like Americans, could be whom we call our little brown brothers. And so some of the descriptions also place the Filipinos as better than the Chinese in some respects. For example, here that one of the writers said, "We hear in America much about the dirt and the savagery of the people of Manila. So far, I have seen none of it. The people are far more cleanly than the Chinese." Again, so these descriptions contrasting the Filipino and the Chinese are trying to show, whether what kind of a what kind of a race are the Filipinos. And so the Chinese here is being used as a kind of comparison, but then again with the view of, can the Americans train Filipinos to be good colonials? So now I go to my conclusion. Again, please bear in mind that this is a work in progress. So many of these conclusions or analysis are very tentative. And so I would really appreciate your feedback. So I asked myself, what do these 7 figures tell us about US anxieties about their new colony? So in relation, when you read about their description of the Chinese merchants and workers, I quote another scholar, Tom Sykes, that, quote, their imaging of the Chinese was motivated more by anxieties about a double Chinese threat to capitalism in the Philippines and in the West. In both these locations, Chinese entrepreneurs were allegedly siphoning business away from ethnic communities while lower-level Chinese workers were seen to be obtaining jobs that rightfully belonged to native groups. So another thing is that their racialization of the Chinese was motivated by the desire to tap into the Chinese market or China's market. In relation to the figure of the Chinese as a foreigner, the bifurcation of the population into quote Chinese/alien and versus Filipino, and the racialization of the Chinese as a dangerous other allowed US government to convince the American public of the salience of its citizenship laws, granting alien status to Chinese and the application of Chinese exclusion laws. So what was facing the United States at that time, when it took over the Philippines? First, one of the questions was how do you pacify the country and carry out your policy of benevolent assimilation? And how do you convince the American public and other imperial powers of American exceptionalism? How do you deal with a country with a heterogeneous population such as the Philippines? And how do you develop the country without Chinese labor? So eventually, as I mentioned, in 1902, the Chinese exclusion laws were extended to the Philippines. And in 1903, the civilian government then started to implement the Exclusion Act. And if you read the events that followed that the question of Chinese labor, of whether to allow them to come in or not, persisted even up to the 1920s, despite the fact that because they needed Chinese labor to develop the economy. The Philippine Bill, again, I mentioned earlier on, created Filipino citizenship, and with being able to choose when they reach the age of majority, whether they want to be considered as Chinese or as Filipino. And I quote from Paul Kramer and applied his work to my own work. On the practical side, the challenges that the United States faced was similar, but also different from the Spanish and other imperial powers. They needed to convince themselves and other people that the invasion of the Philippines and the exclusion of the Chinese were justified. But at the same time, it wanted to exercise control over the country and its people so as to be able to attain its imperial ambitions in the region. Dealing with the Chinaman question in the Philippines, quote, led not only to articulations of difference between Filipinos and Chinese, but also to proliferations of difference among them, forms of difference that were new to both sides, end of quote. So Paul Kramer was actually talking about Filipinos, Christianized Filipinos, and non-Christianized Filipinos in his work, where he demonstrated that the Americans was able to justify its colonial rule by, again, racializing the Filipinos as and dividing them between Christian Filipinos and non-Christian Filipinos. And so I'm using his model, his approach, to also see how the bifurcation of the Filipinos and the Chinese was a way for the Americans, to justify its colonial rule in the country. So that's the end of my presentation. So I hope you have some questions or feedback.
Thank you, Dr. Chu, for that very interesting presentation, and also might I add a very relatable topic, not just to me, but as we've discussed last night, halos lahat naman yata ng Pilipino may Chinese blood nga, di ba? And to add more context to that, no, I was really very focused on that discussion when you even presented the origin of the Chinese people here in the Philippines. Because coming from Amoy, my ancestor, actually, I'm also part Chinese. My ancestors came from Amoy, China, and to attest to that discrimination nga in Manila, in the Chinatown, because of that discrimination that our ancestors had, they were forced to transfer to Nueva Ecija, to Gimba specifically, and they built their own empire there, their business empire. As you have said, ano yan, mga skilled workers. We had a soap factory, we have a candle factory. Sabi nga nung lola ko, lahat na raw ng panglamay, meron daw kami dun sa factory na yon. And we also adopted other Chinese families because of that discrimination in Manila. So nag-adapt kami ng iba pang mga Chinese people, and they also adapted our family name, which is Ang. Tapos maybe to explain why there are cramped Chinese families or Chinese settlers here in the Philippines, because aside from that migration from Manila, dahil parang may economic crisis before sa China, so kahit yung mga from Amoy, directly nag-aampon pa kami, nag-aampon. So talagang dun sa little space that we had, nagka-cramp din sila. Minsan nga hindi na kamag-anak, we call them cousins, we call them aunt, pero hindi na sila kamag-anak, they just adopted the family name, which is Ang. Now, my question is to start perhaps the open forum. No, you've presented as well the recurring themes or the recurring discriminations when it comes to Chinese communities. One would be in Australia, where they take other jobs, the trail of the Chinaman in Australia, as well as their filth, the image of filth, as presented or as documented by the Americans. My question is, aren't we seeing the same portrayal now? I'm not talking about the mestizos. I'm talking about the pure Chinese who are going here in the Philippines, taking jobs from the Filipinos. No? And isn't this a remnant of the American colonization? Or is it a hint that we are still an American colony culturally, mentally?
Well, first of all, I was fascinated by your family story of your family in Nueva Ecija, and I think that is a a story that has to be waiting to be written, because we most of the histories of the Chinese in the Philippines are Manila centered. So we need more regional studies of the Chinese communities in other parts of the country. And your as to your question, yes, that's a very astute observation that in the Philippines, and not only in the Philippines, but in many other countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, in countries in Europe, that there is a resurgence, for example, of kind of an anti-Chinese
Yeah. Just
xenophobia.
recently, about a year ago, 2 years ago, when there was a project, I don't know if it's um, a DPWH project wherein they imported Chinese workers, and there were criticisms. Why not hire Filipino workers instead of Chinese workers?
Yeah, so these anti-Chinese sentiments
Uh,
it was not the Americans also who started discriminating against the Chinese in the Philippines. Even during the Spanish colonial period, they were very much discriminated against by the Spaniards. But the kind of the 20th century anti-Chinese xenophobia, which we call the yellow peril. This is a kind of a discourse that had connections to Europe, and then later on, which went to the United States. In Europe, from the 13th century on, when Marco Polo visited Italy, and then Genghis Khan, for example, took over many parts of Central and East Asia. So all these kind of Orientalist figures already started back then. And China, if I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Edward Said in Orientalism, where China was built up or imaged as the opposite of the Orient, of the Occident, of the West.
The West.
So this kind of looking at China and its people as the other, of the West, has been going on for centuries, and it comes out in different forms, but basically you see the thread there, that this anti-Chinese or anti-Sinicism comes out from time to time throughout all these centuries, and of course the context in which these racism comes out are different, but there's always the common thread that they see China again as the other and their people as the other. And so it's easy to racialize them if consistently these tropes, and these figures that were a result of the yellow peril in the 19th, 20th centuries continues to today. So you're right in saying that these have really clear connections with the past, including the 19th, 20th centuries. Yun nga. And there are also similar threats, the image of the Chinese as
the threat of taking jobs away from the
jobs.
people.
Yeah.
Even the image of filth, the image
Schools.
of sanitation, the image of what do you call this? Parang they defecate all over, kasi may mga ganyang images so and articles as well, no? So parang same theme and same content.
Pero what is also similar is that there are opportunists who use these images because these are stereotypes. Stereotypes meaning, so they're not really real, no? But there are political opportunists or ideologues or who really use it to for their own interests, for their own ambitions.
But I want to add something. You've mentioned that these are not just American views. This can also be traced in Europeans, as you have mentioned, pre-American, so during the Spanish colonialization, these discrimination stereotypes are also visible, perhaps. But is that are you blaming the European Western colonial mentality, or do we also need to admit to ourselves that even without those colonial mentalities, we maybe are xenophobes?
Again, that's a very good question. Because first of all, because we were colonized by Spain and by the United States, we definitely Filipinos definitely somehow imbibe some of the racism, or the racist attitudes of the white colonialists. Spaniards and Americans, they see themselves as belonging to the white race, and that kind of thinking where the white race is superior to non-white races have somehow influenced Filipinos too, like Jose Rizal writing about Doña Victorina or Doña Consolacion, wanting to become like Spaniards and wanting to whiten their skin. So we have certainly inherited some of those xenophobic
But
views.
isn't it convenient to just parang i-point out lang natin diyan sa colonial mentality, pinamana lang sa atin, is it that convenient na ipasa na lang sa natin, colonizers natin?
No, I guess we should be careful in doing that, parang absolving ourselves.
Yeah.
And you can extend that also to our country's situation today, where our economy is always in distress, and that we don't know what our Filipino identity is, and so on and so forth.
You've mentioned pa parang compare, no? The Americans, or siguro hanggang ngayon, no, we're still comparing what is a Filipino and comparing it to the Chinese. But the question is, as you have mentioned, ano nga ba yung Filipino in the first place?
It's a construct, so
just like if we ask the same questions to the Americans, what is an American, by the way?
Yeah, so we have to be careful, to fall into that kind of nationalist, hyper nationalist kind of thinking, where because of the nation state's ambition or goal to establish hegemony, for example, or control over its people, they have to invent all these identities, right? And so, and in so doing, then they exclude other people, because this is the job of governments, to identify, to unify their people into one nation, a unified identity. And what happens is that you exclude people. So we need to be careful then when we are engaged in that kind of debate or discussion, who is a Filipino, who is a Chinese, that we don't fall into the same kind of trap that we believe that there are ways to really categorically say this is a Filipino and that is a Chinese.
And what's worse sometimes is that we use that lineage to discriminate other races. For example, you can't call me a racist because I'm part Chinese, so I can just call whatever you. I can call you whatever I like you to be called. As you have mentioned, chinks, or sometimes we call them inchicks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, SAUS, for example, there is this big discussion about both personal and structural racism. So racism is not just how we deal with
The other
people on a day-to-day basis, but also how such discriminatory views and have been embedded in structures, in systems that systematically discriminate against certain groups of people.
I would like to call on the community. Do you have any comments and questions to our presenter? Okay, so here's one. Thank you, Dr. Chu, for this very interesting talk. I had an impression that these 7 recurring figures became an American way of building an image in the absence or lack of information about the Philippines during that time. Contradistinctive description of Filipinos or Spaniards against the Chinese could be their way as a departure to characterize and give face to the Filipinos in the Philippines during that time. Second, I also have this impression that these figures also focus on the privileging of a pure bloodline against a mestizo will give a hard time to profile since they are mestizos. Like, where will their loyalty be? Thus, negating a mixed marriage will be handy in identifying a Filipino during that time. Maybe they're just categorizing for convenience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jimmy Delia, for that. I certainly agree with you that their racialization of the Chinese is part of the bigger and broader question of how do we categorize the Filipinos? How do we even
What if
describe
Filipino?
Filipino? The same manner where Paul Kramer and other scholars were pointing out how the Filipinos were divided between non-Christian Filipinos, like the Muslims, the Igorots, indigenous, so-called indigenous people, versus the Christianized Filipinos. Again, so that led to kind of this country where there were two kinds of Filipinos and non-indigenous and indigenous Filipinos, or parang in again, this is a product of the American imperialism, as a way for them to control or rule over a country. The way they apply their own understanding of race, but in the process created all these divisions, essentialization of and reifying of identities that have no basis on reality. And then, as to your second point, yeah, and it's true because and somehow we have also inherited that view that there's a notion, there is such a thing as a pure Filipino, that any kind of mixing does not make you a true Filipino. I see that, for example, in debates with, I'm a big Miss Universe or beauty pageant follower, where now Celeste Cortesi, there's this big debate on how could she represent the Philippines, but she's more Italian than Filipino. So we also have, many of us still subscribe to the notion that there is such a thing as a pure Filipino.
Yeah,
And
how do we categorize, how do we differentiate being pure in blood or in culture?
correct. Blood is certainly, that is really has no basis on reality. I mean, is there a Chinese blood? Is there a Filipino blood? There's no such
And how can you calculate? How can you say that you're just what, 10%?
Yeah, correct.
10% Chinese.
Correct. And in this period that I'm studying, it's very interesting because so when they said that the Chinese are not allowed to come into the Philippines, some of the Chinese have mixed blood. When they come in, they say, well, my father is Chinese, but my mother is, let's say, Portuguese, or Malaysian, so, or Thai.
From Macau, Portuguese, yeah.
Correct. So, am I Chinese? And so there were all these questions from the immigration officials to the Bureau of Custom and Immigration, asking them, how do we decide? How do we adjudicate this?
What is Chinese enough?
Yeah. So in the end, they said that parang they applied the one drop rule. I mean, but even if you have just, let's say, great grandfather mo Chinese, but you still have that Chinese lineage. Let's say if you're 1/4 or 1/4, 1/16 Chinese, you're still considered Chinese, and you could not enter the Philippines.
But how do you justify that? So it's parang ano na lang siguro, no? How could you justify that scientifically?
Right, and we have shown through time that the science, that they tried to do this scientifically through eugenics, for example.
Paano yung border control pala? You have a Chinese blood din, ah. Yung border control, no? Ikaw rin.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. correct. So, but this idea still exists to this day. You know, marami pa rin tao na naniniwala sa identifying people through blood.
To
But
add to the concern of Jimmy Dilio, no? Hindi ba yung idealization of the Filipinos by the American can also be traced to the confusion or maybe loss in translation ng resources nila, specifically the Filipinos themselves? Because by that time they arrive here, the concept of being a Filipino is still new.
Mhm.
Diba? Meron pa tayong insulares, peninsulares, tapos yung Filipino na the Filipino is reserved for the elites. Perhaps the resources na misinterpret. Ang Filipinos, ano yan? Ito yung mga anak ng mestizo na dito pinanganak.
Yeah, and then also yung mga regional differences, like say mga Visayans.
Oo, hindi yung Filipino, Bisaya yan, Panay yan.
Oo. So, is one better than the other? Mga ganon. So, it was a long process of
Perhaps it's not the Americans' fault alone. There may be some differences then in the interpretation when they were asking their resources. Because we are also confused with our identity, with our labeling back then.
Yeah, and I guess our sense of, let's say ngayon, if we do exhibit xenophobia or anti-Chinese sentiments, it's not as similar or clearly for the same reasons as Americans to say discriminating against the Chinese in the United States. Kasi parang meron yung Asian versus Asian discrimination, di ba? Pero is that the same as white discriminating against Asians or blacks? Or Asians discriminating against, let's say, blacks in the United States and vice versa? There are scholars who are pointing out that it's not the same kind of racism. So let's say if we go back to Filipinos discriminating against the Chinese these days, parang ano yun you have to look into the historical specificity, of the Filipinos. It's colored or influenced by current Philippine-China relations. It's influenced by even China itself. How is it portraying itself to the Philippines? Even like for now, for example, itong colorism natin, the Filipinos liking fairer skin. Is it trying to emulate American whiteness now or Korean whiteness?
Korean whiteness is the trend.
So it's a different kind of colorism, I would say. So that has to be understood or investigated. So the same thing can be said about anti-Chinese cynicism here in the Philippines. What is driving it? Is it still driven by the old American ways of viewing race, or is it already shaped by other forces or factors that can be both internal, or what do you call it? Endogamous ba yan? Hindi endogamous, indigenous pala, versus other external factors.
Okay. Are there any more questions from the audience regarding the topic for today? We're still isa pa lang yung nagtanong. Siguro they either they find it interesting and ang ganda ng presentation, talagang na-imbibe na nila, no?
Wala silang naintindihan.
Ay, naintindihan kaagad, wala nang tanong. Or hindi naintindihan. No more questions. And so thank you very much for that intelligent and insightful exchange, Dr. Richard. And to the audience as well, thank you. And we would like to give Dr. Richard a certificate of recognition. Let me just flash. Okay. Let me just flash.
Thank you also, Cebuano Study Center.
So thank you for the presentation, and the certificate reads for Class Incorporated General Assembly co-sponsored by UNITAS, Certificate of Appreciation to Richard T. Chu, PhD, for sharing his knowledge and expertise as the Speaker of Class Incorporated titled The Orientalist Figures of Chinese in the Philippines During the Early American Colonial Period, conducted online on June 4, 2022, signed by Professor Maria Luisa T. Reyes, PhD, Editor-in-Chief of UNITAS and President of Class. Again, thank you, Dr. Richard Chu.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again also to Dr. Lulu Reyes for inviting me. It's a pleasure. I always look forward to being able to share my research to fellow Filipinos, pure Filipinos lalo.
Ano yung pure? Pure Filipinos.
No, it's because I live in the US, diba? So it's always something I look forward to be able to share.
And I guess there are lots of confusion in regards with your surname, no? Some may assume that you're just Chinese. You're Filipino.
I'm Chinoy, so my parents are ethnic Chinese, so but I was born and raised here. Like your grandfather, I guess, you know.
My great-grandfather was a pure Chinese, coming from Amoy, China.
Mhm.
And even my grandmother was born there from the father's side. So, and my mother's side is Spanish. So I'm a mix of Filipino, Chinese, and Spanish.
You're a real Filipino because a real Filipino is a mixture of races.
Yeah. Thank you again, Dr. Chu.
Thank
And before we end the program, may we now call on Dr. Hope Sabanpiu, class vice president, for her closing remarks.
Hapon. Thank you for attending the class Second General Assembly and the informative presentation on the Orientalist figures of the Chinese in the Philippines during the early American colonial period, delivered by our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Richard Chu. The presentation identified and described the different figures of the Chinese in the Philippines based on his study and analysis of different sources. My knowledge about the different Chinese diasporic communities in the world, some of which I have visited, has been broadened, especially under the lens of his discussion on race, gender, and the project of empire. Allow me to thank Dr. Richard Chu for enriching our knowledge and making our afternoon memorable, albeit on Zoom. And one day we hope to meet him in person. We also thank our moderator and our secretariat who made all this possible. I also wish to thank our class president, Dr. Maria Luisa Torres Reyes, and my colleagues in class, Dr. Shirley Lua, Dr. Vim Nadera, Dr. Joyce Ariola, for providing the platform for us to share our researches, not only with each other, but to extend it to the community. I also hope that those of you who are not yet members of Class Incorporated will come and join the organization and help grow our research and teaching database. Until the next lecture, stay safe, everyone. Daghang salamat ug maayong hapon.
Before we finally end the program, please be reminded about answering the website form that can be accessed through the link posted in the comment section below. Also to members who were unable to attend the live sessions, this session will be uploaded on our YouTube channel and will be emailed to you as well. And also, please follow the official pages of class and Unitas for more updates. We have our Facebook page, and please subscribe to our YouTube page as well. Again, this has been your host, Francis Kilantang, wishing you all a great weekend ahead. Thank you and stay safe.